have the honor today of giving the introduction of the colloquium speaker, Karol Lang, one of the illustrious faculty of our department. Karol came from Poland, where he received his early education at the University of Warsaw, and studied at the University of Rochester, where he received his PhD. He then spent time at Stanford before coming here to UT as a faculty member. I think that was 1991. He's been a full professor since about 2001. Karol and I worked together in the old days on Rakan decays, and then at a certain point in his career, he decided to focus on neutrino physics, which is what he's been doing for more than 20 years. He was one of the founding members of the so-called MINOS experiment, which is the long baseline experiment at Fermilab, which I think is still the most precise measure of many neutrino oscillation parameters. He's also still active on an ongoing experiment at Fermilab. In parallel, at some point, he started working on what are called neutrinoless beta decays, neutrinoless double beta decays, in an underground experiment in Europe, so that he was really doing two full-fledged experiments at the same time, which I think is, in some sense, a measure of the extreme amount of energy that he has always had. And to top it off, he got interested in positron emission tomography at a certain point and began a program to improve the techniques for that, which is what we'll hear about today.
Thank you, Jack. So I'm very impressed with this introduction, very generous, thank you very much. Jack walked into my office about 20 minutes ago, and I had no idea that he would be coming to my meeting, and I had prearranged to be introduced by somebody who said, oops, I'm in Europe. So I said, okay, I'll handle it myself, but then offered it to Jack, and he's got it. So thank you very much, Jack. So indeed, I will talk about positron emission tomography that we've started in our group a few years ago. And in order to go there, I will actually go through two introductions to provide the context, the full context of what we do. I'll have to tell you about where it's coming, where we're coming out of, and what is the sort of more clinical environment into which we're trying to fit in. Before, however, I start, I've given several talks on this matter and other matters actually this year, and this was all after the breakout of the war. So I decided, and in fact I was visiting Poland during early days of the war. So I decided to dedicate this talk to the future peace and prosperity of Ukraine in times of genocidal war that's going on in Ukraine. I think we cannot, as we civilized world, cannot condone it and cannot just brush it under the rug and continue. It's a fundamentally important issue for humankind. Anyways, switching to physics. So we've been, in our group, we've been pursuing physics that is physics of microcosm, microscale, studying the elementary objects and elementary interactions of particles. And we know now how nicely and beautifully it meshes with our view of the universe at large. It meshes well, and these two pictures are very well known, so I'm not going to discuss them. This is just to jolt your memories. One of the things that everybody knows is that there's a long list of things that we are yet to understand. So we've accomplished a lot, and these accomplishments have posed new questions, and we are working on them. So the list of questions is long. I'm not going to go through it. One thing that motivate my research is that in most of these completely fundamental questions about the scale, why the structure, where's dark matter, what about the lepton and baryon conservation, actually all of these questions are related to neutrinos. So that's what we have been doing. We've been pursuing neutrino physics here for a few decades. And to do so, we've been constructing all kinds of detectors over the years. So that's always convenient if you want to venture into a field where there are related detectors needed. The detector that Jack mentioned earlier, or experiment called MINOS, was sending neutrinos from Fermilab. This is aerial view of Fermilab main ring and so-called main injector through 700 kilometers of the Earth crust to a mine in Minnesota. And it's a lot of beam work, it's a lot of detector work. There are two of them, smaller and larger, were because they've been dismantled since then. This is when you fly to O'Hare, about 10-15 minutes before you land. This is on the left-hand side of the plane. Very often you would see more or less this view. This is Fermilab, the main ring again, and the main injector, and this building. This building is called a high-rise. This is where we spend a lot of time when we do when we have discussions, seminars, and all of that. So this is the building. This is the atrium inside. So there are two wings inside with a beautiful view inside. And this was designed by the first lab director who built the lab and designed the building. In fact, several buildings. That's Robert Rathburn Wilson. As Jack mentioned, we've ventured in our group also to conduct searches for neutrino-less double beta decay. That requires very different technology on the nuclear scale. So those energies at Fermilab are relatively high energies, but then neutrino-less double beta decay refers to beta decays, nuclear physics, and that requires much smaller energies, very different techniques. And the current experiment that we're actually pursuing it's being pursued actually as the highest national priority in nuclear physics. One of the 3 or 4 top priorities in nuclear physics is called the LEGEND experiment. It's not clear where it's going to be installed, but it's using these enriched 76 germanium crystals that will measure exquisitely the energy of transition, and this will be the main observable for the discovery if it happens. Meantime, we continue the experiment at Fermilab. This is the next generation of the MINOS experiment called NOVA, and NOVA again sends this beam across America a little bit even further, this time not into the mine. It's actually the building which houses this largest plastic structure in the universe, as sometimes people are proudly announcing. These cells are you see it here, the small detector and the large detector. This is 15 meters by 15 meters by 80 meters, okay? Plastic filled with scintillation and fibers, with a scintillator and fibers. And read out by techniques that we actually, similar to the ones that we used on MINOS. So when you look at the neutrino interaction, this is an image. This is at couple GeV. This one is in fact a little bit higher even, but it's a beautiful image that this huge detector can actually produce in this way. So we know that Yogi Berra has always great statements, and he says you can observe a lot by watching, and this is relevant to neutrino physics as well as to the positron emission tomography. We conduct these experiments usually in large groups. These are snapshots of from collaboration meetings. In fact, one of them was a few years ago, 5 years ago here in Austin, as you see. About 100 people from NOVA showed up. And I'll come back to this issue because this is actually quite relevant with respect to what we do in nuclear imaging, as you will see in just a moment. So this is my first introduction, where we're coming out. And this is now about proton therapy. So here comes Robert Rathburn Wilson again, and it was motivated earlier by my picture that I had specifically because of the paper that he wrote in 1946. In 1946, Wilson wrote a paper in which he said the proton proceeds through the tissue in such a way that ultimately it strictly deposits energy in strictly localized region within the body. I'm not going to read all of this. You can read it later. And he has a couple graphs that are showing what we now know. We've known for forever. He knew for forever. A Bragg peak and energy deposition, so-called linear energy deposition as protons penetrate through material. This is a modern view of this picture. Okay. Funny enough, we all know that this is the Bragg peak, sometimes called Bragg nose, and we know that this name doesn't appear somehow in Wilson's paper. I don't know why. It's a 1906 Nobel Prize, as you may know. And but the bottom line is that, look at this image here. This is the proton energy deposition, and this is what you use if you are irradiating materials using different energy X-rays, gammas. Very different. Extremely well localized, and most of energy of the proton beam deposited very locally, while the others are sort of, sometimes people say, carpet bombing. So this is again an image from simulations of protons stopping in a material, in water specifically, and this is photons. You see very different phenomenon. This slide is borrowed from Dr. Gunn at MD Anderson, who showed that since the inception of this proton center in Houston, more than 10,000 patients were actually treated in all kinds of types of cancer types, all kinds of cancers.
Just to be fair to the photons, the way they do it actually involves like 200 independent beams. So
Hang on, give me a second. I'm still in my introduction, okay? So this facility in MD Anderson has 5 beams and a synchrotron that produces the proton beam that is being used in the therapy. In fact, you don't really see the scale of this, where the patient is and all that. So I decided to look for better illustration of the scale. And here's a center in Florida. In Florida, this is the patient. This is the so-called gantry which rotates the beam, and this is, they use actually a cyclotron as the source of protons. They're typically either cyclotrons or synchrotrons that are actually used for beam for producing the proton beam. So it's a massive scale. It's a massive scale. Okay. Now coming back to what you said, indeed there are something called gamma therapy and proton therapy now. Okay, and this is sort of illustration that using X-rays, you do a lot of damage to the healthy tissues, while in using protons, you can actually minimize that. You can spare a lot of damage to many types of tissues, and use so-called beamlets, tiny amounts of protons that deposit the energy in a way that you spray according to the 3D image of the tumor into the body. So ultimately what happens is that there are a few hundreds to few thousand beamlets, as it's called, and those beamlets constitute about 2 gray of dose per fraction. So I'll tell you later that there are about 30 fractions. So if a patient is being irradiated, there are about 30 fractions, 30 irradiation sessions. And each one of them is this very scan that I'm talking about. Each beamlet is about 10 to the 8 protons. So in the end, you'll end up with the energy deposited in the tumor tissue to the tune of about 10 to 11, 10 to the 12 protons. And the idea is that if you alter the energy, if you alter the angle accordingly to be as conformal as you can be to the 3-dimensional shape of the cancer, you can achieve what's called now, this is each beam here, you see the Bragg peak, but you can achieve the so-called spread out Bragg peak. Similar things are accomplished with photons, but in photons, you actually keep on damaging the tissues. So this, as it's called, IMRT, which is intensity modulation in both beams, has a different net effect in the body using protons or using photons. So this is sort of showing you what's happening when you use X-rays, photons. This is what happens when you do protons. This is again borrowed from Brandon. He shows MRT, gammas, MPT, protons, and this is the difference. So this is simulation of a particular irradiation. Is if I were using gammas, or I was X-rays, or I were using protons. It's a very different image, and this shows where you would be depositing energy if you were using gammas, which is not where it is not necessary. So this is directly damaging tissues that you don't want to damage. Now there's obviously a lot of science how the energy deposited in a tissue is actually in a tumor is ultimately either impeding its growth or it's destructing it or destroying it. I know not much about it, but so let me only say that oxygen radicals are at central play here, and there's lots of biology and biophysics, biochemistry involved in here, which I will come back to at the very end because it's related to a certain novelty in irradiation physics, oncology, and so I'll come back to this at the very end. I know very little about it, so you can ask questions about it and I will not answer, so it's just what I know when I need to know. There are 112 facilities worldwide doing proton therapy, and this is a map where they are. By the way, it's considered to be such an important and such a necessary direction of oncology, of radiation oncology, that another 100 plus, in fact, are in various planning stages, or construction, in fact. There are 42 facilities in the US, 26 in Japan, 7 in Germany, 7 in China, and 3 in Netherlands. I put here 3 in Netherlands because per capita that certainly is far better than any other country in the world. The Texas centers are, the 2 of them. We have one in Houston, one in Irving, close to both of both of them close to us. And there is another center at MD Anderson, second center, that is being completed. It's effectively entering the commissioning stages. So this is the curve showing per year. So this is, I don't know if people in the back can see, this is 2007, this is 2021. By the way, this graph was just updated about a month ago. I was looking at it for years and it was very stale, but that was due to pandemic. So the answer here is that about 300,000 people worldwide have been treated with protons, and there are other therapies, in fact, with pions, carbon ions, and other ions, but it's a much smaller number of patients, although there are some advantages of ion therapies as well. When you go to a hospital and you look at these devices, you have no clue which one is which. I'm showing here images of CT. What's CT? It's computed tomography, X-ray. Okay, it's a tomographic X-ray. MRI, and this is PET. And from outside, unless you really are an expert in devices like that, you have no clue what the difference is. The inner guts are completely different in every one of them, but from the outside, they look essentially what you see here. And if you take an image of using PET, positron emission tomography, by injecting a so-called FDG, or radioactive sugar that is tagged with F18, with fluor 18, this is pretty much what you see. So the positrons are emitted from places which accumulate these radiopharmaceutical, and that happens when the metabolism is the fastest. So this is a famous place for this is a bladder actually, but you see here other things, and part of the purpose to show this image is that there's a technique of improving your imaging by using time of flight. I'll come back to this in just a moment, and you see that the blurring of the images is different on the left and on the right. On the right you have a time of flight PET scanner, and it's better, it's more powerful in finding and understanding where the tumors are. So F18 decays to oxygen and positron. Positron is immediately, with very little energy, is absorbed by an electron, or is annihilating with electron, and two gammas back to back are produced. So this is for students, and what happens is that these gammas are entering then roughly as dense as possible crystals. We use LISO. This is an image of a LISO, and you equip it with a photodetector that then is detecting the scintillation light that is produced by these photons. If you look at the cross sections, depending on what this crystal is made out of, your 511 keV gammas are fitting here. So there's mostly Compton and photoelectric effects. This is actually for carbon, this is for lead, so most of the materials, LYSO, fits sort of somewhere in between. Now, the so-called treatment plan is as my partner at MD Anderson, it's, I'll attempt a German accent, well-oiled machine, because it is a really well-oiled machine in terms of structure, who is working on it, for how long, and what it produces. And there are 7 stages. Starts on Monday morning, so there's a team of people who take earlier imaging of all the 3 devices that I showed you before, from CT scan, from MRI, from PET. They introduce it as an input into simulations, and they design these beamlets one by one. It takes a lot of work by the entire team, and it is like clockwork, 5 days. Okay? So they start on Monday morning, they finish on Friday afternoon with a summary and sort of maps where things need to be where things need to be irradiated, what happens and what not. Now, unfortunately, that's the end of the story. That's the end of the good news. So you take 5 days, and then you start radiation on Monday morning. So you start on Monday, one Monday, and it's literally it's happening like this. 5 days, and on next Monday, a first patient comes into the irradiation room, and receives 30 days of fractions, radiations, roughly speaking, 2 grays each. The question is, how well all this planning is working? There are uncertainties. One of these images here shows margins of uncertainty, what the energy, what are the problems with localizing the tissue, what are the problems with applying certain beams and all that. So as I say, this is a team of several people working for an entire week on one patient to come up with a treatment plan, okay? However, there are, as I say, this is pretty much the end of good news, because there are a lot of uncertainties and there are a lot of impediments to effectiveness of this therapy. There are anatomy changes as the radiation is ongoing. There are high gradients for proton, so it's great that you know exactly, but there's a danger if you go wrong way, you're actually now depositing this much energy in the healthy tissue. So you have to be careful with that. There are gaps in the knowledge, in really biophysical knowledge of what happens this knowledge is typically brought from gamma irradiations, but that it doesn't fully apply to proton therapy. Patient's population varies. Not everybody's tissues are the same. Your spleen is different than somebody else's spleen, and so forth. The treatment plan is evolving. So patient is being irradiated in these 30 dosages, and believe it or not, it's not being checked what's happening with this. So this is showing, stating the same thing. This is actually taken after also a guy from MD Anderson. It's not only knowledge taken from the gamma therapy that has limited applicability. It is also many other issues related to simulation and application of the beam. Finally, the center costs a lot of money. So each radiation can be translated into a lot of money, and all of this, by the way, has to be approved by the insurance company.
Is the cost hardware or people?
Say it again?
Is the cost mainly hardware or mainly people?
In the long run, it's people. The cost of center is 200 million. So 200 million is relatively peanuts if you compare that something is operating with hundreds of people working on this for, say, 10, 20 years. So there are, in this team, you have physicians, dosimetry people who specialize in understanding how the energy is deposited and how to measure it. There are physicists, typically with the particle physics background. And there's a therapy team, those who are moving patients and helping them and whatnot. Bottom line is that while there's a lot of good news in moving and using proton beam, everybody would agree, there's much room for improved feedback of ongoing therapy. In industry, it's typically called proton range verification. How do I know that my beamlet is hitting what I want it to hit? So that was the end of my second part of the introduction. Now I'll talk about what we do. So time of flight PET for proton therapy is a project that was started about 4 years ago. We were approached by people who knew of a UT Austin, Portugal funding opportunity, and that time that was an opportunity. The theme for the application was medical imaging, and it was a competitive submission, and we were lucky to team up with 3 institutions from Portugal, 1 company from Portugal, MD Anderson, and our group. So 6 institutions. And we proposed a feedback PET scanner to register nuclides activated in proton irradiations. One of the big differences between using proton beam and gamma beam is that X-rays do not change the identity of, don't change the identity of nuclides, while protons do. So you actually activate, you actually make carbon 11, you make oxygen 15, and you make nitrogen 13, and this is happening all the time when you are depositing energy in the beam, in the body. That's because this is the composition of your body, in case you didn't know. So 65% is oxygen, carbon is 18.5%, and these are the main things. One of the important things here is that look at the half-lives of these isotopes as they're being produced. So this is 120 seconds, and this is 20 minutes. So you gotta be, your instrument has to be efficient, and it ideally needs to be, as we say, in beam, very close to the beam. And there are no such instruments essentially in the world yet. So in our case, as I say, we are actually activating tissues, and the activation is what we're gonna be detecting. We will not be injecting, at least in in this project, we're not planning on injecting any radiopharmaceuticals. We will be using what the beam has already generated. It's called positron emission species, or PES. So typical reaction is this p-oxygen, which produces oxygen-15. Now, this is an interesting plot which our colleagues from Portugal simulated only recently. This is the deposition of energy, and this is where the species are being created. This is the position, Z position, of where the species are created. So you see, there's a delicate balance between the energy and where, because protons are slowing down, so there's a delicate balance where this beam is hitting the tissues in such a way that it actually produces the activation. So there's a lot of interesting known physics, but the question is, how well can you take out of the human body? So this is, we decided to focus on brain tumors. And this is not a clinical device that we are proposing. This is a device that is meant to work only with so-called phantoms, so something that mimics either human body or cancers. And the idea is that you would have a room for a beam that would come out, that could come in. So you can rotate this and inject the beam from many directions. The tomographic idea, obviously, is that you have somewhere there in the brain or wherever the beam was deposited, emission of positrons, and they go back to back. So by looking at millions of these, you reconstruct a three-dimensional image of the tissue. Now, this would be mounted, it will be mounted in one of the beams at MD Anderson. So this is the beam, and you remember this is this tiny thing, and the rest is gantry and synchrotron and all of that. And we are building our detector out of lysocrystals that I alluded to earlier, and photodetectors, which are these new silicon photomultipliers, which are coupled directly to each crystal. So we have 3 by 3 by 15 millimeter crystals coupled to, as we call SIPMs, silicon PMs. And these are the fundamental bricks out of which we actually construct the structure. I want to come back. The structure, so you actually see here these double crystal structures. And we are using for the readout electronics from the company that we're partnering with, PETSys Electronics from Lisbon. It's very nice, very concise electronics, and most of the time it works well, right, Kyle? Our first visit, we're having a snag. About a year ago, we went for the first time, because of the pandemic, to MD Anderson, and took effectively back then just chassis of what we were producing, and put it in, or tried to fit it where it needs to be. And so this was a team that was visiting back then, and this is more or less where it would ultimately fit. There are two things that I want to mention in addition to what I just said about PET or PET TOF-PET. So why is it TOF? Well, TOF-PET, time of flight PET, allows for faster and better reconstruction of the image. Time of flight provides a more crisper and with fewer statistics, better reconstruction of the image. Because you know more or less which region of this line of response, as it's called, the photons were coming out of. There's another holy grail in this business, which is called depth of interaction. Because there's additional blurring, which we are not, by the way, correcting in our technology. But it's called DOI, which stands for depth of interaction. Because if you see here, this is illustrating, depending where the photon is hitting the crystal to actually produce light, it actually can produce different lines of response. So there's a certain blurring if I do not know, because of the length of my crystals, where the photons were coming from. So this is not what we're doing, but we're doing this. These are sort of inner guts of the structure which we constructed, designed to implement our design. And to make sure that everything was working properly, we first made what we call a mini PET. Mini PET just had room for 8 such crystals. So this is sort of an image of a drawing of the setup, and this is what you see, crystals and the structures, and just very few of them, and this is where we position a source. So this is the energy response of these crystals, very nicely seen, so-called photo peaks, and the rest are so-called Compton edges. So these are Compton interactions, and these peaks are photo peaks, where all the energy is actually deposited. And we achieved actually in energy resolution and so-called timing resolution, or it's called CTR, coincidence time resolution, quite nice numbers. This is not fully, this is too good to be true, 6.5% in energy resolution. We need to correct it, and we're still working on it. This is the timing resolution, 230 picoseconds, which can be actually pushed if we limit our response to some lines of response to down to 180 picoseconds. If you recall, which you probably don't, on the image that I showed of the commercial PET scanner that had TOF, no TOF and TOF, that has 550 picoseconds. Why? Well, because at least until a few years ago, that was the industry standard. Nowadays, industry standard is closer to 300. I would say 350. If you go to conferences and you hear talks from research groups which purchased recently the best PET scanners out there, they would tell you that that's pretty much what it is. So we are actually here hitting numbers that are better than commercial systems. Certainly smaller, and that's obviously easier for us. But nevertheless, I want to emphasize that this is already really good. This is state of the art. There are no scanners out there that are doing better. There are plans for scanners that would do better, but right now, you've asked people what they have, they wouldn't show you better graphs than these. This is a fully loaded scanner, left and right half, and this is again, as electronics is being inserted. And this is a fully assembled scanner. It actually has a lot of cooling issues, cooling lines, because electronics is heating up, so we need to actually have an active cooling. And what we can do here is insert in the dead center, it's called isocenter of the scanner, a germanium 68 line source, which is a positron-emitting decay, which then produces back-to-back gammas, and image it. So this image is shown here in 2 views, and from the top. If you look from the top, you perhaps can see this dot. Now, this, as you can perhaps see, is actually on the stage, mounted on the stage that can move. So we actually have moved it for about half an hour, and then took slices around sometimes and reconstructed where the source was as it was moving. So this is without using TOF information. This is using TOF information. You could think that it's hard to see that this is actually better. And we can, from this, you can really see that it's better. You see these dots. And not only that, you can then reconstruct the position resolution of what we know about these positions. And they're about close to 2 millimeters precision, which is, again, if you go to commercial scanners, that's much better than what industry has. So we are in sort of, our next step is really to fully calibrate this and fully certify it before we move it to MD Anderson, where we'll conduct all kinds of tests. Again, mostly with, only in fact, with phantoms and the proton beam. And that's where we are on this TPPT. But this, as you can obviously imagine, as you're working on this day in and day out, you start thinking about other possibilities that one could do having such such system or improving a system. So early on, we started thinking about improving the efficiency of the scanning. What does it mean, efficiency? Efficiency or sensitivity means for the same dose, I can detect more pairs of photons, thus I can have better tomographic view of the emerging from the tissue. So this was our first NIH grant that we proposed to have a reconfigurable PET scanner, as you see it. So in dark is what you could assemble this way or this way. It was a very limited FOA in terms of budget, and it was not approved. So then we started looking at really improving this and said, okay, how about if we have 3 panels in addition to the cylinder in the middle? So I have a top panel, which we call the crown sometimes, and a bottom chin. And all of that in 3 parts would also have a readout from both ends of each crystal. So this is, remember this depth of interaction? Actually, the way to do it, to accomplish, is to read it out from both ends, because the distribution of light at 2 ends tells you about where the interaction occurred within the crystal. So this is all simulations. We published it it took us some time to publish it, but here it shows you the efficiency of adding these 2 panels, these flat panels up and down, compared to the efficiency of just the cylinder. So there are standards for measuring or characterizing instruments of that sort, and we are using here lines that are recommended. These are so-called NEMA standards for measuring and understanding the response. And the thing that I want to emphasize to you is that this number here is 25%. And if you go to cylinder itself, it's roughly half of this in the center line of this line of where the possible tissues can be. So addition of these panels make the whole thing a lot more hermetic, and thus improves the efficiency. These graphs actually showing that from the photon sharing of the crystals, we can find the depth of interaction of about 4 millimeters, and from our simulations, which we I think tend to now not trust as much, we would get perhaps 200 picosecond resolution. And a response precision of full width half max position of about 3 millimeters. So we have now reasons to believe that our simulations were far from where they need, well, maybe not far, but they were missing some issues, and we are working on it to improve that. This will be for the next NIH proposal. And the next NIH proposal would be an in-beam PET, which would have this opening for the beam, and otherwise, as you see, even more hermetically closing around the head. We choose head because everything else requires enormous budgets. So I can't imagine a grant to get this built, but for larger devices, that's just effectively impossible. So this is what would be. You can rotate the cylinder, and depending where your beam needs to come in, you could come in here or here or here, and you would be getting the tomography from the activation as I discussed earlier. And this is sort of a possible sort of engineering rendering. So this would be yet another white device in a room that you could see, but this time perhaps would be a lot easier to identify what's behind it. So that was the head tomography, but there was a huge need in the world for looking for metastasis of cancers. How do you do that? Well, you do that by scanning the entire body. By scanning the entire body is a little bit challenging for 2 reasons. One is that you have to work with a decay of typically FDG, which is short, so you're losing statistics as you're moving, and also you never are optimally positioned where possible metastasis is, simply because you are perhaps at large angles. So things are, there's a general understanding that a total body scanner is necessary. So we started looking at it, inspired by a group in Krakow in Poland, where they do it in using plastics. So why plastics? Well, because as they claim and proven, it can be relatively inexpensive. I didn't discuss prices here of these lysocrystals and photodetectors. You know, you can ask me and I'll be happy to tell you more about it. But the Krakow group had an idea what to do, and we had sort of, I mean, it was different design than theirs, but also based on plastic. And one of our undergrads who started working on it when he was in high school worked with our group, and Akil did a fantastic simulation work on it. In fact, employed machine learning algorithm, one of the algorithms that we actually used in one of the neutrino experiments, and achieved here, so this is sort of his rendering of a plastic scanner about meter long, actually exactly meter long, and a source in the middle. And you see that he actually can reconstruct that. This is, since then, we know that plastic is perhaps not the best way to go, and we believe that perhaps for a total body scanner, you don't need to have time of flight. Maybe you can do better. So there are other ideas of how to have a high sensitivity for the total body, but construct it equally inexpensive as using plastic. And the easiest way is to do it using so-called BGO crystals, which are a lot cheaper. So there are other directions that one can pursue this in the future. And these directions go into what I started with, which is that with every fraction, we really are not fully monitoring what's happening with the irradiated patient. So there are at least two ideas that one can pursue that. Well, but before I get to these ideas, there's one other issue that relates to what's happening with the cancer tissue as you are irradiating it with protons. By the way, not only for protons, turns out that with photons as well. This is so-called flash therapy. It turns out that it was rediscovered or discovered just a couple years ago, a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, that the dose that people usually deliver in about 2 minutes, if you deliver in a millisecond, is actually damaging or destroying cancer tissue more than it is destroying the healthy tissue. So it's not understood right now why it's happening, because it essentially is counterintuitive and counter what people thought was happening. So there's a big, in fact, in a month there is a conference that, because of the teaching I cannot go, in Barcelona, that is completely focused on flash therapy. So flash therapy is not used anywhere because it's too novel and people don't understand why it's working. But in various tests with animals, they understand that the effects are exactly what we would like to do, to accomplish. You deposit a lot of energy, and it turns out that you mostly destroy the cancer and you save the healthy tissues. So that's one thing. The other thing is you can actually start combining this therapy with other use of PET to monitor what's happening after first, second, fifth, or 25th fraction. Believe it or not, it's not happening. There are some centers that do here and there. They typically, doctors say, well, we know what's happening, but no from, again, this, statistical distributions that they typically draw from, but never for the specific patient. And so you can do two things. You can either employ PET after every radiation, just like we're proposing, but also you can radiosensitize the molecules, radiopharmaceuticals, by adding, for example, adding to gold nanoparticles, augmenting them with additional elements like nickel 64 or copper 63, which in irradiation mechanism actually would produce positron emission species that would help you further map the location of the energy deposition. And I didn't discuss SPECT, but SPECT is essentially production of gammas from nuclear photons in interaction of protons, which can also be used as mapping of the or where the interactions were occurring. And combination of all of these can actually be used to monitor what's happening with or after each irradiation. So I know you are probably tired, so let me finish by saying, well, these are sort of my initial thoughts rather than final thoughts. About 6 years ago, as you remember, there was a call for bridging barriers. So I wrote a two-pager that probably most of you did, and obviously didn't go anywhere. I don't know where this bridging barriers is now, but I shared this note a couple years ago with some of my colleagues, and they said, look, this is exactly what you're proposing, exactly what should be happening. What am I referring to? Well, I showed you these teams, large teams of people working on particle detectors, particle experiments. Well, in nuclear medicine, nuclear imaging that I am describing here, in in research on tomography, groups are 2, 3, 5, and they never share anything except when they have patents and they have published, and it's a paranoia that I have no clue why people are clinging to, because they will not become rich, that's sure, and they will not become famous by doing what they're doing. It's complete idiocy, I'm telling you. And most people that I shared this at a couple conferences completely agree with me. I know it's a strong opinion, and I know it's a strong statement, but that's, I'm concluding that it's actually right. So the question is, can an effective collaboration be formed modeled on research projects in experimental particle physics that would accomplish in nuclear medical imaging what has not been accomplished over the last few decades by a number of small and isolated groups worldwide? It's actually, in particle physics, there would be no progress if a group wanted to make an advance in particle physics. There will be zero progress, okay? Zero. So, in view of conclusions, we're working on it, and some people that are pictured here are actually in the audience, so I thank you for your attention. Any questions? I'll be happy to answer. Michael is first.
I probably should have had a really great intuition for all the things you could stick into that device and image. I guess you can put in TEDs, you put in rocks. What's the range of things you can stick in there? And what's the resolution you would get for various things?
Well, obviously, the denser the object you stick in, the poorer the resolution because of the gamma scattering.
So no particle physicist heads.
Correct.
Okay, but so low density good. Okay, anyway, I'd love to get that.
Your book would be great there. Oh.
Yeah, just going to ask, in particle physics experiments, maybe you can recognize that you need this big scale to do anything. Is that true in this field?
It's true, absolutely true.
Because, the downside is you only have one effort, right?
It's
Somebody might come up with a great
no,
idea.
look, it's absolutely clear that it requires simulations, reconstruction, imaging. One of the reasons that my images were so lousy was that we actually are limping in our consortium on simulation. But there's detectors, there's photodetectors, there's crystals, there's a way of assembling, there's engineering. Exactly what we do in particle physics, just, one-to-one mapping, one-to-one. There's, probably not a missing element.
So you mentioned in these prototypes that you're developing, you're aiming for a head size. You can imagine a body size detector, but that limits the cost. But I imagine it actually, the long term, if you wanted to actually use this in a clinical setting, the steps to get this approved as a device for human use there are many. So have you considered, a smaller scale device? I imagine there are steps where you would image tumors in animals. Maybe, is it possible to
Yeah.
smaller and bigger?
Yeah, this is obviously a typical way people proceed. First, they show tests results with phantoms, physical, plastics, water, doped plastics, and blah blah blah. Shapes, different density, different position. You can do that. The next step is obviously do it with animals. And we had some initial plans of using animals, but we decided that we remember our project was effectively, most of it was developed under pandemic conditions. So we didn't feel that we've advanced it in terms of testing on the final stages enough to actually justify use of animals. Animals suffer too, right? And we've been sensitive to that. So, but absolutely, this is always there's an idea. Okay, once we have the detector, we can travel.
You said about the time of flight, I think that the temporal resolution is about 200 picoseconds, and that translates to about 1 millimeter of resolution, of the spatial resolution.
No, that's not what I said. No. So you can.
Something about the temporal resolution, and you said something about the spatial.
Yeah. So the time of flight gives you a faster convergence on the image quality. Okay, but there are in fact ideas of using non-tomographic application of very fast response detectors, which would indeed, rather than use these lines of response, these lines from the tomography effectively, you would say, from one interaction, because of the time that I know, I can actually tell where the interaction was occurring. That requires about 50 picoseconds. So here we are improving the convergence, but we cannot determine from the time of flight anything. It's just faster statistical convergence.
So if you had a resolution of 50 picoseconds, then maybe you could say something.
That's correct. So when you have 50 picoseconds, certainly join our group.
So in one of your slides, you showed the Bragg peak, and then you also overlaid the production of the PET isotopes. And maybe you could bring that back?
Yeah.
Because I was a bit confused by that, because it seemed to show that although it was tracking qualitatively, it seemed like it had a kind of a broader response.
Yeah, so
Linear scale there.
say it again.
The vertical axis is linear, so it's almost, it doesn't seem like it's very, the Bragg peak is quite sharp, but then you have this.
Right, that's because remember that the Bragg peak, the activation has two components to it. It's the position and the energy. As the protons are slowing down, your cross section is changing with the energy for the activation. So that's a combination of the two. This is very, very new, simulation. We're going to be checking how well we understand
Is
it.
that not a problem, that it's
Well, this is the edge that you really want to know. So that's probably not, but you know, it's a fair question. It's a fair question.
It does have a sharp, at least a sharp.
Yeah, sharp fall off here. That's right. Michael.
The comments on collaboration were really fascinating. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on why it was that particle physics was able to develop this collaborative international mode when there clearly could be pressures against it.
I lost the first.
Well, particle physics is actually, it stands out even within physics. The collaborations are very large scale, they're international, and you pointed out it isn't, you know, it isn't inevitable for humans to develop these sorts of structures. So why did it happen?
Well, because complexity demanded that. The complexity of particle physics instrumentation is enormous, and that requires, you know, you cannot develop it within one group, one university, or one country. It just is necessarily.
Pointing out, here's another case where people's lives depend upon it. It's equally necessary and it didn't happen.
Well, let me. I'll ask Jack to comment on it. I'm sure he's got some wisdom to tell you about. But let me tell you one other factor that is at play that I didn't even touch upon. I did say insurance has to pay for it. The throughput of patients is absolutely essential for the hospital. This is the dark side of what's happening behind. And it's a very dark side. And you know examples from not oncology how many dark sides medicine has. But in this place where each irradiation is about $20,000, okay, that is immediately highlighted because of the scale of the cost. So the moment you perturb this flow, you are their enemy. Nobody, look, all these ideas that I told you about, nobody wants to hear about in medicine. Nobody wants to hear about it. I'm serious. Yet when I ask them, wouldn't you like to know? Yes, but. And the but is insurance, cost, throughput. So one of the beautiful things about flash is that, and this is what we're going to be arguing in the NIH proposal, is that actually I can accomplish faster throughput. I can actually accomplish faster throughput of patients than slower. Because that doesn't take, by the way, the dose that you apply here to a patient doesn't require 30 irradiations. It requires typically 4 or 5, as people think. People think because it hasn't been done, okay? So one could, I have a hope that by arguing how one could improve monitoring in the context of flash therapy, you can actually introduce that monitoring. This is called sometimes image guiding or imaging guidance of therapy. Yeah.
So I know that you said that for your PET scanner, the one that you're building, you're using 3mm isocrystals. I know that there exist smaller ones, so you can get a higher spatial resolution. Is it just a cost issue? Because they're a lot more.
It's mostly the cost issue, indeed, because remember, having smaller crystals turns out to be not a big problem, although the cost grows fast, but it's also photodetection. And there are ideas how you actually employ similar, less granularity photodetectors for more granularity crystals. There are ideas how to actually economize on the two. I actually believe that if we can truly show that we are accomplishing about 1.5, 1.6 millimeters, which there are indications our device is doing, we're done. I don't want to be going anywhere else. But it's a, yes, you actually can go to, if you can find papers where people are arguing for 0.7 millimeter, by 0.7 by 0.7, ours 3 millimeters by 3. People argue 0.7 millimeter crystals. Actually, well, there's a longer story to it. So yes, there are arguments, but I think they are weaker as the more I know about it, they're weaker to me. I think this is probably it. So thank you very much for your attention.